Welcome to the Liberty Alert with Gregory Seltz, sponsored by our friends at the Lutheran Center for Religious Liberties here in Washington, D.C., a program that cuts through the chaos and confusion in the culture today by talking two-kingdom citizenship, bold biblical principles for a robust public Christian life. And now your host, Dr. Gregory Seltz.
Good day, Washington, D.C., and friends of the Liberty Alert all across the country. I'm Gregory Seltz, and every week we try to cut through the noise and cut through the chaos and bring you the issues, especially the issues that concern people of faith, and talk about how we can respond faithfully from God's two-kingdom perspective to be a blessing in our culture, even as we share the good news of the gospel as well. And in the news, it's all about Ukraine right now, and you know, the images are horrific, obviously. Tyranny is on the move, and people are fighting for their freedom, even giving their very lives for their freedom. And that's what we want to talk about today with our special guest who's coming up in just a minute. But one of the things I want to remind you, we don't really have a foreign policy perspective. That's not the role of the Liberty Alert, because we stand for religious liberty, the sanctity of life. We defend the institution of marriage and educational freedom here in the States. And so we do not have a foreign policy division. But while we don't have that, I think the Ukrainian situation does help us, though, because it puts on display the horrors of communism, the horrors of socialism, and it challenges us to a proper view of liberty and a proper exercise of liberty and a proper appreciation of it as well. So today we are privileged again to have on our program Peter Roskam, former Congressman of Illinois, former Majority Whip, and today we're going to be talking to him because he has some firsthand knowledge of something that is very much in the news every day, and that's Ukraine. He was an election observer in 2014, and he had an op-ed just printed in the Chicago Tribune that I think is something we all need to read, and he was talking about the Ukrainians' commitment to sovereignty. Peter, it's great to have you on the program today.
Thanks, Greg. Great to be with you. Thanks for inviting me.
Well, listen now, we're a First Amendment organization in America. So generally, what we're about is religious liberty, sanctity of life, defending the institution of marriage and educational freedom in our borders. We're not experts in public policy for foreign stuff. And that's what this issue is. But the reason I wanted to talk to you is because in your op-ed, you were talking about their commitment to sovereignty, their patriotism, if you will. And then I read an article, came out just about the same time, about a lot of Americans, if we were invaded, we wouldn't stay to fight. And so that I want to get to that. But let's start with the op-ed and talk through the context of what's going on there. Talk through the points that you saw firsthand, because you saw people who yearned to be free.
It was amazing to me. So just to set the table, it's 2014, and I was invited to serve as an election observer in Ukraine. And this is a fairly common thing with emerging democracies. And the idea was to have the world come in and observe the election procedures and give it an imprimatur of approval to say, yes, this was done in the proper format. And so people from all over the world were there. I was part of a Ukrainian or an American delegation, but there were Canadians and other European countries. And I was assigned to a city called Chernihiv. Now, Chernihiv is north in the country, and it's about 50 miles from the Russian border. Just a couple of weeks ago, was bombed heavily by the Russians in this current war. And on the way out of town, Greg, we stopped at a place called the Bikivnia Forest. Now, what's interesting about this was it was a quiet sort of forest off the roadway and some memorials and so forth. But I really didn't know what I was getting into when we were out there. And there was a solemnness to it, and something was, you could just tell something significant had happened here. Well, come to learn that this is a place where they estimate 200,000 people were secretly buried. And these were people who were killed by Stalin in the 20s, 30s, and 40s. So they were tried and arrested and shot in the back of the head and taken out and dumped here. And the Soviet Union for years, literally for decades, denied any involvement in this thing, of course. And then the overwhelming evidence was just too much. And so finally in the 80s, they acknowledged this crime. But that was sort of just a touch point, just to walk through. Then the next day, I'm up in Chernihiv, this northern city, and we're out in the countryside a little bit out of town in a schoolhouse where they're voting. And as an election observer, you go in and you're looking around and you're just trying to determine if things are running according to procedure and so forth. And it looked good and all normal. And I saw these two old Ukrainian women walking up the stairs. And they were sort of a labored way about their walking. And they had traditional dress and they had a scarves around their head, like right out of the movie set practically. And up they're walking. And their gait was kind of difficult. And I thought like their ankles were sort of swollen. You can just completely picture this.
Right.
And in their walking, and I didn't have an opportunity to interact with them because of the language barrier. And so I just began to guess, and I was just completely guessing. And I thought to myself, I wonder what these two women have witnessed in history. And I sort of guessed, and I thought, well, they look like my mom's age. So they're born, let's say 1930.
Wow.
If they were born in 1930, they were born into the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic.
Yeah,
and
USSR.
all of the tyranny
Right.
that meant. Now, you and I, we're in the same vintage. We are Cold War era children. You know what I mean? The Berlin Wall went up when we were born, basically, and right around then, 1961.
Right.
And so they were born into the Soviet Socialist Republic. They also would have survived what's known as the Holodomor, which is the man-made famine that Stalin foisted on the Ukrainians, starving millions of Ukrainians. They survived Russian invasion, German invasion. They survived the reassertion of communist authority. They survived independence. They survived the Chernobyl disaster. They survived the Orange Revolution, incoming from the East in terms of the Donbass and Crimean annexation. And these two women showed up. And as I began to think about it, it was mind-blowing for me, and it was so encouraging. Why was it encouraging? I'll tell you why. It's because they weren't naive. You know what I mean?
Right.
These were people who had seen things, and without question, they had suffered. But they were showing up to vote, and it was as if they were witnesses to history, and their presence, in my estimation, just deserved so much respect. And there was this matter-of-factness about them that was just like, yep, we're here, we're going to vote. And they communicated so much to me just with their presence, Greg. They didn't have to say a word.
Well, and for me, that's what I loved about your op-ed, is because they knew even the basics of liberty, what they were worth fighting for, what they were worth dragging their bodies, if you will, to vote, what that was all about. And that's what troubles me a little bit with the sense that we have over here, because, to me, we have incredible liberties here in America that still resound to the whole world. We have people who can't wait to get here. I know people from all other parts of the world that just say, man, I can't wait to get to America. And yet I read that Americans, if we were invaded, not only wouldn't we vote if we got ticked off, maybe from a microaggression or something, but if we were invaded, we'd leave. And I'm like, what's the disconnect? Because I'm hearing now a lot of support Ukraine, support Ukraine, support Ukraine. But these are from some of the people who actually think that our liberties here are not to be cherished. Doesn't that kind of blow back on us a little bit and show us that maybe we've got to get our house in order?
Yeah, it sure does. And, maybe what can come out of this is an object lesson for Americans, the type of Americans that you're describing, and they're seeing, what the Ukrainians are doing and how tenacious they are and how they're fighting.
Right.
And there hopefully will be an awakening. I take your point in terms of the inconsistency. And I think part of the challenge, Greg, is that there's so many Americans that think that the natural, or they think that the liberties that you've described a minute ago, they think that's normal.
Right.
It's not normal. It's
not
a
normal.
Complete aberration of history.
Correct.
History is filled with miserable tyranny and difficulty and oppression. And yet you and I find ourselves in this country that is a complete outlier historically.
And let me just say one more point before I get to your second op-ed, which is how do we then look forward? The windshield versus the rear view mirror, because that was another great way to kind of move this discussion forward. But it also troubles me, like you just described about Stalin, you described about the killing fields, and I didn't really know that history until I read what you had written. And yet, again, like I said, so many of our young people today, they're talking about this philosophy called socialism or communism and how beautiful it is. Well, it killed 100 million people last century. And so when you talk about this thing, where do they get this notion that it's going to be kinder and gentler than this? The Ukrainians are demonstrating to us what it's like to fight that thing back into its box.
Yeah, that's right. And it's so insidious and it's so pervasive and pernicious. I had a discussion one time with Larry Arnn, the president of Hillsdale College, and I asked him, what book should I be reading? And he turned me on to a book that I'm going to commend to you. It's called Darkness at Noon. It's a famous novel written about the Stalin show trials. And it answers this question: why would anybody surrender their life for something that they knew was a lie, even though, and it wasn't to sacrifice for somebody else? It's a really interesting question about the dark-heartedness and the dark nature of communism and where it ends. It's called Darkness at Noon.
Okay,
but it answers that question because it purports, communism purports to be sunshine and roses and goodness and so forth. But behind it is a steel fist of oppression that will put you in a gulag so fast it'll make your head spin.
Yeah, I remember reading about, I think it was Mussolini and the Stasi, and how they had like this beautiful place to live. It was like this place everyone wanted to get into so they could live like the elites, except once you got inside, it was terror beyond imagination, because if you were suddenly found out to be not in line, the Stasi would come up through the dumbwaiters and suddenly your apartment was vacant, So people have no clue what it's like to get past the facade. All right. So you talked about a way forward, and in your second op-ed, you were talking about windshield versus rear view. Break that down a little bit for our listeners.
Yeah. So I had an experience. It was a couple years after I was an election observer. I was invited to a conference, a quiet, small, very low-key meeting for a weekend outside of Berlin. And there were members of the Russian Duma and Federation Council and some members of the German Bundestag, their legislature, and some other members of Congress. And the idea was to have a discussion. You can picture this. To have a discussion about foreign policy issues that are significant.
Right.
And during the course of the weekend, there was a dinner, and I was walking across the property and I saw one of the Russian leaders, and I thought, this is my chance. I want to go talk to this guy. And I'm out of earshot, so I can actually have a straight conversation with him, and nobody else is listening. And so I come up to him and I said, look, talking about Ukraine, I said, Americans care a lot about Ukraine. Mm-hmm. We got a million Americans who trace their heritage there. We care deeply. We're really upset about what happened in Crimea and what happened in the Donbass region. And I stipulate that Russians care about what goes on in Ukraine too, because they're right next door to you. But I said, let me ask you this. What happens if you completely dominate Ukraine? What happens if you go in and you completely run them over? I said, what do you win? They're going to hate your guts forever. They're going to fight you forever. The world's going to hate you. It's going to cost you a fortune. It's going to be miserable in terms of treasure and lives, and it'll be a disaster. And it will be very, very expensive for you. What do you win? And Greg, he turned to me and he said, Congressman, we will have the satisfaction of knowing that the Ukrainians are not more successful than we are. And I thought to myself, what? I didn't have a category for that. Who talks like that? Who thinks like that? Who admits that? And he wasn't being ironic. This was not a joke. This was not like some clever, I'm going to light this guy's candle. He was not kidding. And what it disclosed to me was a worldview And upon reflection, I've realized that it was just looming malevolence. It was a foreshadowing of what was to come.
Yeah.
And, the Russians that I was interacting with, Greg, were always looking through the rear view mirror.
Right.
You know what I mean? It was always
right.
litigating sort of past grievances and what some deputy undersecretary of state had said to them 20 years ago. You know what I mean? And the Western attitude, we don't think this way. We look through the windshield of life. We're looking down the highway and we're trying to figure out, okay, we got a problem. Let's negotiate. How can we come up with a solution here? And it was just breathtaking. And that's what Ukraine is dealing with right now. Because, is it a perfect democracy? Of course not. Right. Is it a democracy? Is it a group of people that wants to affiliate with the West? Clearly, they want to be Western affiliated. And they don't want to get sucked into this larger sort of vortex of all this Russian influence. But it was a conversation I will never forget.
As I read that, and I was thinking, it was almost like he's my little brother and I'm not letting him be bigger than me. And then I thought, wow, you would destroy, you'd bring the world to World War III for that. But maybe the bigger
fight practically.
Yeah. Well, maybe the bigger perspective, though, and I think this is something we need to learn from here in America, too, is it also shows you the power of that ideology. So when that ideology doesn't work, when it destroys everything in its path, instead of admitting it's not, these fundamentals aren't, the secular state cannot replace the church. The secular state cannot be the solution for all the problems of life. That was the USSR. That's what they were supposed to be. That was East Berlin. That was all that stuff. Well, it always comes to decay. When I was in Berlin, and I was actually where Luther grew, and I saw the East German side of things and how still drab it was and how depressing it was and how it was radically different by that line of demarcation from West Berlin and from West Germany. But comes a point where they're going to hold on to that ideology until they burn everything down. Maybe that's kind of what's going on here.
Right. I know exactly what you're describing. When I was a little kid, we went as a family and we went over into East Berlin for a day. And it was like walking from a color movie into a black and white movie. And I was picking that up. I'm 8 years old and I'm picking that up.
Right.
And just the destructive nature of it over time and just the heartache of it. And now it becomes, it changes, it morphs, it shifts. But it's the same. It's power. It's sin. It is aggression, and it is oppression.
Yeah,
and it's meant to put people down. Whereas what you're talking about every day it's the gospel. It's the gift. It's supernatural. It is life-giving, and there's buoyancy, and it is an invitation. And this, by contrast, is so dark.
Well, and it's liberty, we always talk about there are two aspects to liberty. There's the temporal liberties that even sinners have in this world that God still gives us. And unfortunately, that's the liberty to even destroy ourselves in a lot of ways. And then there's the liberty that comes because of what he has done for us in Christ. Absolutely. And they're both so vital. And America actually understands the tension between those liberties, but it also understands its preciousness. The thing I want to talk about learning now is how do we learn from the Ukrainians' willingness to stand up to this, and whether we support that or whether we jump in and all that, that's foreign policy stuff that may be beyond my ability to work through that with you today. But I do think we need to learn from them as we support them. And that is, they understand what they're fighting for. I said it this way one time, we have walls, if you will, to keep people out, bad people sometimes. You have a front door, you lock the door, those kind of things. There are countries today that have walls to keep people in because they want to get out so badly, but they cannot. And that radically shows the difference between these philosophies. People who just want to come, that's because they say liberty there. People who are scared to death but can't get out, that's the kind of stuff that communism breeds. So why are our kids so enamored with socialism, communism, and all these things if we're now looking at Putin and seeing all the things that Putin and Stalin and Mussolini and Mao all brought to the world? Why are we saying, and that's something we need to bring here? I guess that's my first thing. And then I want to know, what can we learn from their patriotism, and then how can we help?
I think, there's a little bit of shiny objectism here. In other words, there's things that are described as a bumper sticker: equality, fairness, and so forth. Those are all nice on the surface, but then to go deep and understand it and have a deeper understanding of what those concepts mean, we've got to make sure that they're well defended, and that the left doesn't steal that language, basically. Okay. And so I think that there's, it's incumbent upon one generation to teach the next. Remember, Ronald Reagan said it: freedom is only a generation away from being lost. So it's not as if this is just a birthright. It's got to be actively defended. And I think that's on us. That's on you and me and everybody, for us to make sure that we're articulating those values in a way. And I think that this is a teaching moment. This is a moment where there is bold-faced aggression that is filled with lies and nonsense, and that is what Putin is doing. And you've got a group of people that it's easy to relate to the Ukrainians. You look at their cities before the war, and it's like, I don't know, hey, that's a place I could be walking around, and people can relate to that. And and I think that what we do and what we see is people that are saying no. When Vladimir Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, was asked by the State Department if he wanted to get out of town, he said, "I need ammunition. I don't need a ride." You know what I mean? It's like, what are you talking about? We're staying here. I was able to meet the mayor of Kiev,
Klitschko,
big boxer.
Yeah, Klitschko, man, I love those guys. Came in to see me, and this is 2018. He comes to my office, big guy. He's huge,
charming, funny, really, really great. Yeah. And what's so interesting is, he and his brother are multi-millionaires. They could be living in Saint-Tropez. They could be living anywhere they want. But those brothers are geared up and ready for the defense, actively defending Kiev. And I just think there's heroes among us. Like, let's recognize this, as opposed to wringing our hands about wearing masks and this, that, and the other thing. It's like, wow, these guys are bringing it.
Yeah, aspirational. I mean, I think not only these guys were the best boxers in the world, they're some of the brightest human beings in the world, and then they were willing to go back to their neighborhood and defend the freedoms of all people. That's pretty impressive stuff. And that's stuff to learn from here back in America, that like you said, not only are these freedoms to be cherished, but you've got to actually defend these things. Because let me just see if I can put it this way. We talk about equality of access here, and then freedom to live, virtuous lives, obviously, but no guarantee of the outcome. That's what liberty is. Liberty and security are always in inverse relationships. That's America. That's Ukraine, versus equity, which is Russia, which is equality of outcomes. But then the state determines everything and takes all your freedoms and your choices and all those things away and says, this is what you will do and this is what you will do. That's what's on display here. And we're seeing in stark contrast those two things. And it is good to see our country siding with Ukraine. But sometimes philosophically, I say to people, but your philosophy kind of aligns with Russia. And maybe you ought to step back from that and see what you're really thinking. Is that something we can learn?
I hear you. Listen, I understand the part of this that's making you crazy and the inconsistency. And you look at Joe Biden, who did a terrible job in Afghanistan, and that was basically an invitation for Putin to move and to be aggressive and all of those things. So you just got to stipulate that happened. All right, now that happened. Now if we're able, notwithstanding that, to say, we know who the good guys are and we know who the bad guy is, and let's all side with the good guys, and let's make sure that they're well equipped and supported in every conceivable way. Then let's work together on that basis, and we can litigate these other things, the cause and so forth, in terms of what prompted Putin to move. And you and I both know it was weakness and fecklessness on the part of the administration that was basically a green light. But let's move forward, because the Ukrainians don't have the luxury of sort of contemplating these things.
Well,
there's an urgency to this that's just breathtaking.
Yeah, and I think you're right that's why the American people are standing up for Ukraine. That's why we want to support Ukraine. That's why we want to defend liberty, especially because they want to defend it. They want to defend their own liberty, and they're just asking for our help. And to that, we all can rise up. And I think that's what's exciting. And I think, like I said, like you were just talking about with Klitschko and those guys, we can learn from this. Even back home, we need to eschew, we need to jettison this equity stuff, because the other side of that's the Putin stuff. That's the stuff we are now all seeing on display as the thing we should think is wrong and destructive and malevolent. It's hiding behind flowery language. It's hiding behind flowery concepts, but it's tyrannical in practice. And it's proven that for the last at least 100 years. Okay.
Yeah,
and I think
that's right. And
go ahead.
It's interesting because something that you said just prompted a thought, and that was when you offer to help someone in your own life and they're kind of like so on your help, or they're not taking your advice or whatever, then you're like, hey, you know what? I can't want something more than you want it.
Right.
But if somebody says, oh, thank you for your help, I'm going to do exactly what you've suggested, and they're striving and they're working for it, then what a joy to help them. You know
exactly.
what I mean? What an honor to help them.
Right.
And so that's what I think is part of what's resonating with a lot of people in the West with what they see happening in Ukraine. They're like, you know what? They really want their freedom. They value it, and they're willing to fight and die for it if necessary. Yeah, we can help them. We can do a lot. So let's make sure that we're on the side with clarity, bringing real relief and real support. And the Ukrainians, God bless them, have completely overperformed so far.
Exactly.
And are sort of, they're up against, one of the biggest armies in the world, and they're hanging in there.
Great odds. Well, Peter, thank you for bringing this to our attention today. I would ask you all to go back and read a Chicago Tribune op-ed. And then is the windshield versus rear view, where can they go find that? Is that out yet?
It's out there. You know what? And if people want to, I'm putting some more content up on Instagram. So people can follow Peter Roskam on Instagram.
Peter Roskam on Instagram.
That's where I'll be posting some videos and stuff.
All right. And we'll be bringing you back on to let people know more about this in the future. So thank you for bringing this to our attention, because this is a learning moment for us, even here in America. Peter, God bless you and continued success in all the things that you're doing. Thanks for tuning in today. To get to know our LCRL DC work better, check out our website at lcrlfreedom.org. Contained there are resources to empower your public square dynamic discipleship. Or check out our weekly Word from the Center opinion piece every Friday at facebook.com/LCRL Freedom. Till next time, God bless you always. I'm Gregory Seltz. Have a great week.
You've been listening to Liberty Alert with Dr. Gregory Seltz, Executive Director of the Lutheran Center for Religious Liberty in Washington, D.C. This program has been brought to you by the Lutheran Center for Religious Liberty.